And we are now live.
We are live, and Senator Bray has joined us. This is a joint meeting of Senate Finance and Senate Appropriations, and we're here. Tom Cavett did the revenue report yesterday for the e-board, and normally we would have had him into both committees for a half hour or so, an hour in the afternoon, but we thought, because this year's been so extraordinary, that it might be better if we had a longer period of time. I know my committee was very interested in, do we know, are there winners and losers in this whole COVID change in the economy? What do we know at this point? What don't we know? So Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ann. I don't know if everyone was in on the emergency board meeting. I don't want to be redundant. I know some of you have heard this 2 or 3 times already. Okay, I see some heads shaking. If you were at the emergency board meeting, raise your hand. So not too many. Yeah, just a few. Okay, great. It'll be redundant for some, but I'll sort of go through general things. But I do want to leave time for Q&A. And although we have a lot of time, it looks like, so I don't think that'll be a problem. But I'll just give sort of a quick review and background. There are still 2 things that are driving the state economy and state revenues. And those 2 things are the epidemiological path of the pandemic and the extraordinary federal fiscal and monetary responses to that, to the pandemic. And both of them are unprecedented and enormous in size. So the effects on the economy can be a kind of whipsawing effect where you have enormous declines early on that were pandemic related, and then enormous jumps and spikes in various areas that are related to a federal response, the likes of which we've never seen before, both in terms of speed and magnitude. So when we did the forecast in August, which is the last official forecast that budgets were based on, we had a couple of months of actual tax data, but it was quite muddled because of a bunch of moratoria that existed for some of the consumption taxes, deferrals that were being allowed, and then a filing deadline extension that moved things into July, and then a post office that was still delivering in August mail that was postmarked before July 15th. So there were just a combination of things that made things quite unclear. It was clear that there were steep declines in places. It was clear that there was some offset that was occurring, but very little of that offset was showing up in tax revenues. And a lot of it, when you traced it through, initially was tax exempt. So all the PPP money, for example, the Paycheck Protection Program money was tax-free. But the expenditures that were made with it, whether it's for payroll or for other business expenses, gave rise to taxable events that occurred downstream from it. And there is a little cartoon, Senator Sears, on page 8. That's, it's a joke, but it's the way the economy works, and it's a picture of a mother who's homeschooling her child, and the child says, "Mom, I know you're working, but I need help with math. How soon will your stimulus money trickle down to buy me a new Lego set?" And it's that spending, it's that, money comes in. The first thing that happened, and lots of different kinds of money comes in, but the unrestricted money that was sent was just $1,200 per person per taxpayer with additional money for children. that lands. The first thing it did was it shot the savings rate way up. So there's also a chart on that you'll see in the presentation on page 18. But the savings rate spiked to over 30%, and it's almost never higher than 15%. It's back down to about 15% as of November, but that's higher than it's been at any time in the last 40 years. And the 33% that it hit is higher than it's ever been at any time. So this money poured in, and sort of like as if the whole water table of the state rose, the springs that were, flowing a little bit started gushing, and springs that nobody knew were there started popping up. And some of that economic flow of money ends up being taxable and gives rise to revenues that we started seeing in the first 6 months of fiscal 21 that were consistently above target, and also were quite widespread. So we take these apart and try to look if there are single events that are driving things. Very often, if there's a big jump in revenues, we go back and we'll find a processing issue or something, some big event that's kind of a one-time event or something like that that explains it. This was not explicable by any of those sorts of things. It was very broad-based. It was showing up in personal income, in corporate, in sales and use, in motor vehicle purchase and use, in property transfer tax. It was consistent by month, more or less. I mean, some of the taxes come in quarterly, so you got little quarterly bumps, but it was across the board. And when we looked at the granular data in early January from tax, was very broad-based. So there is still a lot of uncertainty, but that information shows the power of deficit spending at the level that it's at. I mean, it's really staggering. If you look just at what Vermont got, and Vermont got a disproportionate share on a per capita basis of the pandemic relief money from the federal government, among the highest per capita of any state. But if you look at that in aggregate, it's about 20% of the total state economy, so total state output in over the last 12 months. And there is probably more on the way. So we did this forecast with a December control run from Moody's that we use as a baseline, which we modified, but we modified it in December before we knew the results of the Georgia elections, and before the latest $920 billion rescue and relief measure was enacted. We thought that was likely, but not for sure. And then before there was consideration of what's now proposed at about 1.9 trillion, still who knows what might happen to that. But the likelihood there will be further deficit spending, both pandemic and related and other, is much higher than it was before. So I think that represents upside to what's happened. The money's dropping in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways, and with really uncertain timing. So sometimes there's money that, first it's appropriated, then you say, well, what's actually been dispersed? And then even what's dispersed may or may not actually have represented a whole lot of action on the ground yet. But it's all now a big part of what's happening in the economy and what's happening to revenues, and it's the reason for the radical upgrade in revenues that we've seen. And I believe there's still upside. The risks have to do with the pandemic, the course of the pandemic, and with potential refunding in the filing season. So there are still some outstanding refunding issues that depending on how things play out, and it's complex. There could be more refunding than we're expecting, although we've upped that a lot. So I believe it's a conservative number, even though it's a very high one. But all of this is still quite uncertain, and we'll be monitoring all these things monthly. I don't know if, we'll need to do an interim forecast update. I think we should have done one after the first quarter, because, the guidance would have been very different. We're doing this for private sector clients on a monthly basis, and it was clear, even before the first 6 months ended, that things were much, much better. And certainly there could have been some adjustment. We're not really set up in state government to do that frequently, but it may be that that will change. We'll be looking at that month to month. Just in terms of the pandemic and the epidemiology, the good news obviously has to do with the availability and rollout of vaccines that are highly effective, and the rollout hasn't yet been what I think anybody would have hoped, but it's moving, and there are plans for it to accelerate, and that's the light at the end of the tunnel. And it's just that there's a lot of darkness between where we are now and the end of the tunnel that has to do with current viral spread, which is higher than it's ever been and projected to get even higher, both at the national level and at the state level, and mutations that are creating viral strains that could be more transmissible. It appears to date that the vaccine's effective against the ones that are known, but that's still a bit of an open question. And then the question is, can herd immunity be reached before other mutations that may not be dealt with by the current set of vaccines create added problems or delays in putting the pandemic behind us? I think some of the more conservative estimates by the Department of Financial Regulation and the people that they're working with in tracking the path of the pandemic and the vaccinations that are occurring in state and the like shows something in late fall of this year as being kind of an outside point that they think there might, we might be at herd immunity, and some of this would start looking like it's in the rearview mirror. But that's an open question. So, stay tuned to all that. The roller coaster ride's not over, and there could still be a lot that changes with all that. There are a few charts and maps and things in the first part of the handout that have to do with pandemic. One of them is a map of the United States that shows, total cases as a percent of population. And in so many of these maps, Vermont has been a standout. You'll almost any metric you use in terms of the health outcomes and the like, Vermont is at the top or close to the top in the nation. There was a time in early November that I had was contemplating some travel to the Southwest, and I was checking, travel restrictions and quarantining in New Mexico, and they had this website, with a map of the country of people coming from these states had to quarantine, and people coming from states that they had painted red on the map had to quarantine, and painted green didn't have to quarantine. And the map was entirely red except for Vermont and Hawaii. It sort of made you proud to be coming from a place that had dealt with the healthcare side of it in a really competent way, and also a society that was responsive to that, such that there really was a reaction to the guidance and directives that came out. So we saw a drop in mobility in the early part of the pandemic in Vermont that was way lower than any of the surrounding states and almost any other place. And that really kept rates low early on. There are big economic dividends from that. And we've seen that at the national level with nations that have controlled the pandemic and then had virtually no business impact. Taiwan will show growth year to year in output in 2020. No disruption to manufacturing, very little disruption to any business, and virtually nothing in the way of deaths and caseload. And the same in Vermont. We can't separate ourselves from the region or the rest of the country. There's a tremendous amount of commerce that goes back and forth. And we see that also in the mobility data. But still, the fact that Vermont was relatively good caused a lot of people to come to the state and work remotely from the state. We haven't seen tax revenues from that group of people yet, because that they won't file until the April filing season, or whenever they choose to file. That won't be due, and nobody's paying estimated taxes from that group. But there's some upside from that, and also there's certainly anecdotal evidence that there's been some permanent in-migration that's been associated with Vermont being a relatively safe place to be. And but for widespread broadband access, it would have been even more, there would have been more benefit. I know I'm a broken record on this for those of you that are in economic development committees and the rest, but broadband, the importance of broadband has really been underscored by the pandemic, and the remote workers and the capacity to work remotely, I think, will be a much more longer lasting aspect of even after the pandemic's gone. I think there'll be a lot more remote working that happens, and that is potentially of great benefit to Vermont. There are silver linings, and as you said, Ann, there are definitely winners and losers, and that's a way we can make the state more of a winner. So there's a lot in the report we can touch on. The bottom line with revenues is a revenue table on page 19, and that just sort of shows what the change in revenue expectations were from August, and then below it, a pre-pandemic comparison with where we are now relative to the pre-pandemic January 2020 forecast. It doesn't seem like just a year ago that this happened, but this time last year, very few people were talking about a pandemic being, would occupy our lives. But so relative to August, things are way up because of the impacts of the federal deficit spending. And general fund is about $160 million up in fiscal 21, 155 in 22. That recedes in 23 and 24, but is not zero. So there are some lasting impacts from that much deficit spending that occur. The education fund also benefits, is up considerably because of the two large consumption taxes that are there, the sales and use tax and the portion of the motor vehicle purchase and use tax that go to the ed fund. So that's also substantially up. And the transportation fund, even though it's up 16.4 million in 2021 and 9.4 in 2022, it's still a little bit below the pre-pandemic forecast, about 13 million, as is the general fund in fiscal 21. It's still 23 million below the year ago forecast, but it does end up being higher in 22 and 23. And if there's another big tranche of federal deficit spending, either for pandemic or for other purposes, that could raise tax revenues going out even further. So that's kind of the takeaway from it. There's a whole lot of more granular information we can talk about if there are areas. I think we'll turn it over to Q&A and see if what areas of interest you all have that you'd like to ask questions about.
Questions at this point? Jane?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay, I can't hear you very well. I just want to.
I got a 1/4 inch clearance here that makes all the difference on my mic.
Well, it's nice seeing all the members of Finance Committee. I see some colleagues I haven't seen in a long time, since hazard pay even. One of the things I'd like to just reiterate from a budget perspective, and that is the comment you made relative to the general fund pre-pandemic. And I think with this, when people look at it without looking at underneath it, I just, for those of us who are working in the budget, and keep reminding people that there's a difference between our base spending obligations and an infusion of one-time money that's not available. So I just want to go back, because you had made a comment. If we look at the general fund, even though it's up, it's still 27.4 million less than what was projected pre-pandemic in January 2020. And really, it looks like when we get through all this slug of federal money, for those of us who are going to be on the budget committee in fiscal 2023, we're kind of back to where that spending and that revenue challenge, presents itself again. So for those of us who are making those financial decisions, I just want to stress that. But if you would speak to the Ed Fund and what the impact that means, because certainly finance and that letter that went out with what would be the proposed property tax rate increase was of great concern, and will be dramatically influenced by these revised forecasts. So could you speak to, obviously, the sales tax is a big driver of how that Ed Fund is turned around.
Yeah, I'll let Steve Klein talk about how that filters through to the Ed Fund and the tax rate. Steve, are you on? Or Stephanie?
Steve's
or Graham?
here.
I see names.
Or Stephanie. At least they're
on their call. Anyway, while we're waiting from them, I'll just reinforce what you said, Jane. We're getting there are going to be two areas of kind of one-time things that are happening. So one-time deficit spending that is pumping up the economy and generating elevated tax liabilities and therefore tax revenue is one part of it, and that's what's showing up in these revenue forecasts. The other thing will be the opportunity with monies that flow through to the states, or the states control in any way, shape, or form, for spending that could be both pandemic related, but also impact economic development and other issues that the state would like to address. So there could be a once in a lifetime opportunity to have, potentially large chunks of money. And a lot of the money that came in first had these crazy controls around them of you had to spend it really quickly and right away. So there wasn't the thoughtfulness that normally would have gone into an expenditure of that magnitude. I mean, if we had a $10 million program that somebody cooked up and said they wanted to spend $10 million of state money, we'd analyze it to death and do options and figure out all these, sorts of things. Here, like $200 million gets spent with an afternoon of commentary and, a couple phone calls. And so it's certainly, that there will be more money coming, both with this $920 billion recently approved act and probably more. And so all of those, I think, are have this sort of one-time consideration. Steve, are you on yet, or somebody? Graham, do you want to address the education
I see Graham
fund
and I
issue?
see Stephanie.
I can't address the specific question about the education fund, but I've been told that Catherine can, and she's in Senate Education right now, and so she can follow up with Senator Kitchell, or if she makes it back here in time.
No, I don't need it. I've got the
Here's
sheet.
Steve.
I wanted
Yeah,
to
I'm on
see.
too. Go ahead.
Steve's on.
Can,
Yeah,
can we
so Steve-
restate the question on the education fund? I'm sorry.
Yes, to talk to the committee about what these revised forecasts mean relative to that December letter that went out in terms of the 9-cent property tax increase, and what the revision will mean relative to mitigate that original proposed increase.
So let me just do that quickly. So the answer is the education fund dollars were pretty traumatic. It basically eliminated the 58 million shortfall. So that is gone. And that's of the FY21 money. Then 22, because of the money that was in, it also allowed 18 million to carry forward into 22. So the 22 money allowed the 9-cent tax increase to drop to about 2.6 cents. But that's with 18 million in the bottom line. So you as a legislature will have to choose, do you take the extra one-time money and make that tax rate 0, that increase, or not? That'll be within the realm of area you can choose. So basically, you're looking at no unfunded carry forward problem, 18 million on the bottom line, and a 9-cent tax increase dropping to the 2.6 cents, with the option that you're going to have an option of whether or not to eliminate it totally.
Thank you. That's what I
This
thought
is-
was important for people to have presented in terms of the interrelationship between this and that letter.
The other
Sorry,
point
I'm unable
was
to,
this.
I mean, oh,
Okay, I've got Senator Sears, but this was, in all probability, one-time money.
No,
In the ed fund.
no, it's actually the upgrade, and Tom can speak to this, but if you look in his out years, it may not be quite as high in the next subsequent years, but most of that is ongoing. And I don't know if, Tom, did you look at your 20?
Oh, because that's,
Yeah, no,
Okay.
it recedes, in the out years, but it's still non-trivial. I mean, for the education fund compared to pre-pandemic, it ends up being about $18-19 million more per year, longer term. But it's the big swing is between the August forecast and the current one, and that's very substantial for 2 fiscal years, and it gets cut in about half after that.
And so just a notion about the 23 on, that's why you're going to have to decide what to do with the 18 million, because you'll have to take into account what's happening with grand list growth, what's happening with revenues in 23, and where do you want to put yourself in that out year. And that's why it's up to you to figure out how you want to address
And
the last
Steve,
2.6.
Steve, can you speak to, in FY22, that assumes the normal cost change as well?
The
For retirement.
FY22 number includes all expenses that are currently attributable to the fund, including the $37 million change to the pension obligation. That's all covered.
I've got Senator Sears and then Senator Starr and Senator Bray.
my question, Tom, has to do with, I've got a couple of questions. One of them is the chart on page 12 of the unemployment. And I would note that Bennington and Rutland counties, and it looks like the Kingdom are all the worst
Unemployment.
in terms of unemployment.
Mhm.
But Bennington and Rutland are very similar to their New York counterparts. This leads me to the question that I had being a member of Joint Fiscal Committee, and that's, where do we target money to those that need it the most, rather than just some kind of a formula that doesn't seem to take into account the actual losses of that business or that individual. I have a feeling that some people did very well during the pandemic, grocery store owners for one. But others, were horrifically hit, like the hospitality industry. Second part of my question is on the property transfer tax increase. Looks like certain towns, you know, and particularly in my district and the Wyndham County district, were the ones who had the highest increases. And I'm curious if what impacts those will have down the road on those communities. So that's a three-part question.
Yeah, so, yeah, the unemployment rates have fluctuated a lot, both statewide and by county. If you look at the chart preceding that on page 11, it shows by state unemployment rates in pre-pandemic in February of 20, and then in April, and then again in November, which is the latest observation at the state level. So right now, Vermont has the lowest unemployment rate in the nation, and it was pretty close to the lowest in February before, but had spiked all the way above 16%, almost 17% in between. But the way unemployment is measured sort of doesn't contemplate something like a pandemic being the cause of unemployment. So if somebody's staying home, because they have to take care of a child or teach a child or care for someone who's ill or is concerned not going to work or not looking for work because of health concerns related to the pandemic, they end up showing up as not being in the labor force and therefore not being unemployed. And so, it's a metric that doesn't have the same meaning. It's still better to have a low unemployment rate than a high unemployment rate. And this speaks, well in general of the state, but it's the variations right now are really difficult to sort of base regional policy on. That said, there are parts of the state that are perennial laggards in terms of economic growth and economic development. And to the extent you can focus development programs that help those parts of the state, they're going to be better off. And that does sort of tie into your question about property transfer tax revenues and the impact in certain towns. So there has been a fairly substantial surge in property purchases, property sales, transactions. But the number of transactions, and this is now the data on page 22, which is a table that's sort of showing the top towns in terms of growth, is based on a 12-month period ending in December 2020, so calendar 2020 versus calendar 2019. So this includes the pandemic period in the 2020 data and everything beyond the pandemic. So initially, property transfer activity dropped sharply during the pandemic because they couldn't get people out to do house inspections, and lawyers almost always do closing stuff in person, and that was hard to do. And so there weren't a lot of transactions right away, but then they just went through the roof. So we've seen about a 33% increase in the value of property transfer tax revenues, the value of the properties that are sold, but actually fewer transactions. So about 0.5% fewer transactions, which means the transactions that took place were higher value transactions. And sometimes that would be skewed by, a big non-residential project that might be in the mix, because this is every kind of property here. But given the towns that we're looking at, for the most part, that's not true. This is heavily residential, which is true with building markets and other aspects of real estate, that residential has been where all the action is. So the towns that have benefited heavily. I mean, you see the population, towns with big populations generally have more, property transfer tax activity. So it's not a surprise that Burlington is at the top of the list. But what is a surprise is that so many other low population towns have growth in property transfer tax revenues that are comparable to Burlington. And if numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way down that list are, towns that are in or near resorts and places with recreational amenities. And that's been where a lot of the out-of-state interest in home purchases has been. And if you get down to number 17, which is Barnard, you see the cumulative percentage of the growth that's represented by those towns. So the top 17 towns represent 50% of all the growth in property transfer tax revenue over that period. And the top 43 is 75% of all the growth. So if you've got decent broadband access, you can attract remote workers just about anywhere. And obviously these places that have a lot of high-end properties already, this wasn't, there's also been a big surge in new construction starts with single family starts, but they'd been depressed for a long time, and it takes longer. So the places that the high-end properties existed in were in those resort towns. That's where people wanted to go first. And how many of those will be permanent, still an open question. But that's one aspect of economic development to consider, and to consider with respect to different parts of the state.
Next, and then Senator Bray.
Yes, I was wondering, Tom, if you or Steve, last year, if I remember right, we left an increase in place that the communities actually voted and passed within their towns of a school tax increase. And I'm wondering if that has been looked at, because all the years that I served on our local boards up north here, I always kept the increase within a penny or two. And if there was a good year where money got left over for whatever reason, I carried it forward, but still left the school tax increase at a very low and modest rate. And we did have a lot of problems with school budgets prior to that. But after using that method to keep the school tax increases very low, we never lost a school budget, and we built new buildings and bought new buses, and we did very well. And so I'm wondering what would happen if we left the school tax increase at the rate that the town raised their spending and moved this money forward to offset increases into the future, to keep those increases very, very modest.
It's Steve.
I was going to say, that's exactly what you all are going to have to decide on. And I think that's going to be the work of Senate Finance and other committees to think about what you do with that $18 million surplus. Do you carry it forward like you talked about? You use some of it to keep the rate low? That's all in the level of the discussion you're going to have in the next few months.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense to me, is to keep the increases low, carry the money forward to help the next year, and educate our children like they should be educated.
The other thing that's floating around out there is that the schools are getting millions of dollars through the federal ESSER 2 program, and we don't know what they're going to do with it. So it's not just our millions that are floating around. They've got millions floating around.
Yeah.
Put me on the
Yeah,
list, Madam Chair.
I've got Senator Bray.
I just asked
And
to be
then
put on the
Senator
list, that's all.
Okay, now, Mark, then I've got you, and then I've got Senator Hardy. So where's Senator Bray? There he is.
Did you put me on the list, Ann?
I did. You're next.
Oh, I'm next. Now?
I saw your hand earlier.
Oh, good. So Tom, I have two. Oh.
Next as in after.
After
Senator
you
Bray.
go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cavett. So I wanted to follow up on earlier on, you were talking about risks related to exposure to refunds. And I know we had a brief conversation in finance about PPP dollars arriving, not being treated as income, and then on top of that, also being treated as a deductible. I think that came out of the December HR 133 legislation. And so we didn't land anywhere on it, just noticing that it seemed peculiar to both have it not be taxable and then treat it as a deduction. So I don't know the size of the exposure on just the PPP dollars. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and what other sorts of refunds are out there, and to what degree, like PPP, apparently the state of Vermont could depart from federal recommendations and not give the deduction. So could you fill us in on that stuff a little bit?
Yeah, there are actually a whole bunch of tax law changes that could impact both company balance sheets and tax liabilities. And it's difficult to sort of play those out in a large scale. We have lists of the PPP recipients at the high end. You have the name of the above $150,000. You have the name of the recipient, and then you have a range of value for the award. Below $150,000, you don't have the name of the recipient. You just have the town that they're in and the NAICS code that they're supposedly in, to the extent that's accurately designated. And then you have the exact dollar amount of the award. So it's not like we can just line up tax filings of those entities with tax department data and say, what if we lost 100% of that? And what if we, lost 50% of that? But what we did was we did go through a fairly large number of entities to look at aggregate tax filings, one by one. And in aggregate, it does not represent a great deal of money to the state. So about half of the PPP recipients file as corporations, and about half are pass-throughs that end up in personal income. So it doesn't look like that is as big an issue as we initially thought, although we have put added money into refunding, in part because of that, and in part because of concerns that tax year 2019, which affected fiscal year 2020 revenue, was really strong, and estimated taxes are often set based on prior year performance, and so we felt there could be too much in the way of estimated tax paid, and there might be refunding from that. We also felt that there would be both corporations and individuals that might have a sudden decline in profitability and yet still have paid forward for a while and be refunding. So we ramped up refunding based on that, but we're seeing even higher levels of both estimated and paid taxes. And again, there's a lot of information you don't get until the filing season starts. So, there's no crystal ball into that. But from what we know now, we think we've got a comfortable amount of refunding in there, and there will still be a lot of revenue based on the fact that, it's not just the initial receipt of the money, which was tax-free for PPP. It was not tax-free if you're getting unemployment insurance. That's taxable income. And if you look at the withholding tax, the largest withholding taxpayer right now is the Vermont Department of Labor. And that's not a situation that normally occurs. It's usually, one of the big employers in the state. And so it's the PPP money is not taxed when it comes in, but when it's spent, if you use it for payroll, for example, which is a fair amount of it is supposed to be used for payroll, then the money is taxable to the recipients of the pay that get the payroll. Or if the company then, would have kept those people on anyway, and is just getting a free ride with the money, and they spend it on anything else, then what they're spending it on often gives rise to a taxable event as well. So it's, I can't say for sure, oh yeah, we've got plenty of refund money in there. I'll still be, we'll be on pins and needles in April and March, but it's one of the issues that we consider.
Thank you.
Donald.
Madam Chair, one of the, I had a couple, I feel that we are racing ahead of the information that's going to be made available. And I had a couple underlying questions and observation. Observation first was when money began to be, the 1.2 billion began to be spent by us. It was a remarkably collegial and march forward, and the various members of the Appropriations Committee, based on their skills and abilities, managed to give good presentations, and the money went out. That was last year. There was plenty of loot to go around for everyone. This year, all the people that participated in that have been saying to themselves, when it comes to appropriations, what would I have done differently if I know today what I didn't know last year? So this round is going to be much more educated, less cordial, and I would say sort of from the get-go, kind of a less sharing opportunity. It's going to be tougher. What I'd hoped to learn from Tom today was, in this time of growing disparity between the well-to-do and those that are working to catch up, how have our citizens been affected by it, and what would he recommend that we look at to see that that disparity does not increase as a result of what we did last September and as what we were going to do this year. It seems we're already sort of trying to divide up and figure out where the money's going to go. And finally, Tom has been careful to say we don't know for sure. We won't know until the data is not in yet. And I was wondering if, as money committees, we would have a recommendation on or an understanding of when those questions would be answered, so that it isn't divided up and it isn't spent before we get those answers. And that has something to do with how we might or might not schedule this legislative session between now and when we adjourn. So I would like to know about the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, and whether or not this, our spending to date, has made that a wider gap, and what we might do about it when we find out what the money actually is.
Yeah, so we have the state spending, which was 1.25 billion out of about 5 billion total, to the extent that we can track by state the flows. But so that's a part of it. So the 1.25 billion, the state had some control and say over within the federal regulations that controlled that. And I fully agree that it would be great to look back and say, what things really made sense and worked and what things could have been better and how we make them better. I wish that had been done at the federal government level too, because essentially what they've done with this next round is just the same old stuff they did the first time. Let's just do it again, and there was a minor change to PPP. At least there was some revenue loss requirement that was associated with it, but it was, it's 25% loss in one quarter in 2020 versus 2019. That doesn't necessarily mean you lost income or profit. You could have had a situation where you had a bad quarter and then things took off. And that was true with a lot of companies, actually. You could also have had a quarter that you lost 25% in sales revenue, and you brought your expenses down by at least 25%, and you had no loss in profit, and then you carried on fine the rest of the year. It's still a pretty low bar to clear in terms of targeting the money to the entities that need it most. And there are a lot of entities that were the hardest hit that didn't, for whom it did not make sense to even apply to PPP because they didn't expect to have any employees or very few for an extended period of time. And they've been proven right. It's been a longer, it wasn't just a 3-month event. So, at a much larger, at a 30,000 foot level, there's healthcare planning that's gone on around federal government response to a pandemic. That's pretty extensive. There are playbooks that have been developed around quarantining and communication and all the rest. There's no comparable economic playbook at the federal level that says, all right, if that's going to happen in terms of the best approach to healthcare, what do you do in terms of the economics? What's the best thing to do? And do you use some old unemployment insurance system that's a state level thing with ancient computers and systems, and then try to funnel billions and trillions of dollars through this? Or do you just send out checks to everybody because you can't figure out who really needs them and who doesn't? You could have a much smarter approach to things in all of these fields, and that hasn't been done at a federal level yet. Even with the checks that are sent out, you will have more money for the businesses and the people who are most affected if you target the relief. And not everybody needs another $600. Not everybody needed $1,200. There's some nonprofits I'm affiliated with that they're getting checks from people now from $600 because they say, hey, I just got $600. I don't need it here. That's why the savings rate goes up. That's why Bitcoin purchases and gold purchases and day traders are trading like crazy. This is money where it's not needed. And so, people don't do with it. Well, all right, that creates stimulus, but it's not targeted. It wastes money because, there's more spent than needs to be spent. And if you just want a stimulus spending above and beyond the basic need, then that should be targeted things that give you great return on investment. That would be something like a national program to roll out broadband in rural areas like they did electricity, after the Depression. Things like that have a payback, not just send out checks to everybody. So, from an economic perspective, if you send out checks and you're going to do it indiscriminately, at least, if it's not pandemic related in terms of the loss, and unemployment is clearly pandemic related. That's going to people that have lost their jobs. So, that's fine. That's definitely targeted. But even with the other checks that go out, if you made that progressive, if you had a lower cutoff or more with families with children that are low income, or situations like that, you could have balanced some of the inequality that's occurring with this. I think that on balance, this has increased inequality the way the money's gone out rather than reduced it. And it's not an easy thing just to turn that around, but those are some of the ways that it could have been done. At the state level, it's even harder to do. So there are things, that can help level that. And we can be thoughtful about that to the extent we have discretionary money. So spending on things that provide equality of opportunity, like job retraining, there'll be some jobs that are not coming back. And so money for job retraining that's not rushed and hurry up and spend it in this semester because it's no good after December 31st, is not the way to do something like that. But if there could be that kind of spending, it helps both the educational institutions that are providing the training, and it improves the output and productivity and opportunity for Vermont workers who have lost jobs. So anyway, there'll be a lot of policy options joint fiscal and others can hopefully lay out and provide that can aim things in that direction.
Could I make a comment, Senator?
Yes, Jane.
Just for the other committee members, we asked Tom to speak at joint fiscal to lay this out, because there was a lot of concern around particularly the grants for businesses. And the first rounds that went out, if you looked at where those grants went, it wasn't strategic at all. And we knew that, and this gets back to the comment Senator Sears was making earlier. And we were, it was a difficult process. We really wanted to target. We felt that the need to do that, and Tom provided, I thought, some very good testimony. So I would say if there's an area to look back is the way in which those, particularly how some of those business grants were administered. And what we were doing was, once again, simplicity on the state level, I guess, which is sort of the same as maybe what happened on the federal level. But I just wanted to reference back some of what Tom is saying today with our efforts at joint fiscal to approve spending for business grants, but do it in a way that we were providing the greatest relief to where it was needed, where the impact had been experienced the most. And that was a very difficult and sometimes a bit rancorous discussion about how best to do it. And in the governor's budget adjustment, there's 10 million proposed from this general fund one-time availability to go to business grants. So I think we need to take the experience that we've had last year and take a hard look at, how that money could best, is it targeted and is it in the best way? And so I think we've got some work ahead that ties into what Senator McDonald is asking, and that is, what did we learn and how can we apply it to make better decisions? But I for those on joint fiscal, we found Tom's testimony and about the need of how to use the money very helpful. Unfortunately, it didn't end up quite as targeted as we hoped, but
Madam Chair,
we tried.
Senator Kitchell and the Appropriations and Joint Fiscal did their damnedest on our behalf when we weren't here. And I'm not questioning or diminishing. I think they were heroes. They sometimes said no, and they did the best they could when we're not here. We are now here, and we'd like to know from their advisor, Tom, how to give us a new playbook that we could all consider, and then as we go forward. And we seem to be tempted to divide the money up right now and say, where it should go. I hope Tom can give us a list of things that if we were trying to keep this disparity between the well-to-do and the rest, what are the things we can do that would bring that make that gap less wide, and what are things that we should avoid that will make the gap more wide in this environment? That would be one of the more helpful things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of time constraints around the last spending package, and I can certainly understand that. It seemed like there still was time to make some adjustments, but I can understand why people resisted that. And I don't know what all the time constraints might be, both on monies that may be flowing from already approved federal programs, this latest Relief and Rescue Act, and then a subsequent package which might be even larger. So, we will have gotten about $5 billion from the initial 2020 tranche of things. We'll get probably about another $2 billion from the rescue and relief money. We can see about $1.5 billion, and then through PPP stuff and things like that, there'll be more. Now, some of that's there's some states saying, some of there's not. And then with a further tranche of, if it is something like 1.9 trillion, that could be another 3 billion or so to the state. If there's money that's less restricted, both in terms of time, use, application, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for really remarkable, once in a lifetime investments in the state. And if they're tying everybody's hands and has to be done a certain way, whatever, then it's going to be much harder to do. So we'll certainly, joint fiscal, is at your disposal to look at all that stuff, and we'd be happy to do that.
That's it for now in questions.
Senator Westman,
Yeah, I was going to.
Senator Westman has,
but you
Sorry.
muted.
okay.
So Tom, first I have a comment. Your property transfer tax revenue, if you had a column that said number of sales and volume, it would help me better understand within those communities how fast those increases. Because when I look at Stowe, the average price has driven everyone that's local out of town, and but the second question is, or comment is, rooms and meals and the high unemployment towns, I think have a correlation, because I think where you have high unemployment, you have a lot of people paying rooms and meals are off dramatically. But underneath that, and this is where my question lies, because Airbnb and VRBO and all of those online rental groups are up, can we separate out in the property transfer tax where those are coming from? Because I think for the traditional hotels and motels, it really looks dire to me, given the fact that you would have VRBO and Airbnb up so much.
Yeah, so you mean not property transfer tax, but in the meals and room tax?
And the rooms and meals tax, because that rooms and meals, even though it's all down dramatically and it's all in certain communities, within that too, if what there is left in rooms and meals is coming from those short-term or online rentals, it says that our traditional inns and
doing even
those
worse.
Are in a worse spot. And it helps me think about the question that Senator Sears asked earlier: who's doing the worst, and who are the people that were most in a position to lose from. Is there some way to drill down there?
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of reporting data on meals and rooms, and just back on the property transfer tax stuff, I'll be happy to share with you that entire file because there are interesting things in that. And it goes back to 2018. So it's 2018, 19, and 20 data on number of transactions and the value of all transactions. And so that might also have some more interesting stuff you'd want to look at. In reporting meals and room tax revenues or even commenting on it, it's, unlike e-commerce in the sales and use tax, where we can say, to the extent we've categorized things well enough, and that's not perfect, we can add all those up and say e-commerce represents this amount, and that could be reported monthly even, and we look at breakouts, in the case of meals and rooms, there are so few firms that comprise the online short-term rental market that you would run into probably, we can check with the tax department and see, but I think you'd run into confidentiality issues about publishing data on that. Now, some of these companies like, Airbnb will actually send out press releases occasionally and say how much, business they have in a state or how much, they're paying in taxes or whatever. But generally speaking, if there's just a small number of taxpayers that are involved and there are confidentiality issues that come up, and I think that would probably be an issue if there's anything, very detailed statistically that was presented. But, it is clear from a lot of reporting, not just in Vermont.
So I just would back up. So they're considered the taxpayer. For example, I have an Airbnb. When I rent it, I sent the rental rate. They don't. They charge the amount, and then they take the sales tax off the top and they relay the sales tax to the state. So that's considered them paying the sales tax and not
Meals and rooms tax.
not acting as my agent.
Yeah, the rooms tax is paid by Airbnb. So they're sort of like a marketplace, the same way like online marketplace type, entities pay. So yes, the tax payment comes from the, from the marketplace, like, VRBO and Expedia.
So it's VRBO,
Airbnb.
HomeAway,
Yep.
Airbnb. So the tax department couldn't in one bucket say, this is from them and here are the more traditional places.
I'd want to explore that with Craig Bolio and just see what kind of a report we could issue that would give you the information you need without running into confidentiality issues. It's so wide. The reporting on the success of Airbnb type businesses in rural locations during the pandemic has been widespread. So it's not just a Vermont thing. And so I think, your deduction is correct and obvious just from that information. Whether we could generate, I'll bring this up with tax and see if there's some kind of a report we could generate that would give you information that would show kind of, the percent decline in everything. That might be the way to do it, would be to not report on that part of it, but just, have everybody else and then do some percent change kind of stats. And you could compare that with the other percent change data and understand better what's happening to the traditional hotels, motels, and places of accommodation.
Yeah, because when I look in communities like Stowe and like the community I live in. And when I look down through that, the Manchesters, the Mad River Valleys, I'm not so worried about people in short-term rentals. I think those places are going to be okay.
They are.
But I think the main streets in those communities will be devastated. And we really need some way to drill down to find out the information about those, what the main street looks like in those communities.
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to work with you and tax to try to figure out a way to get you information that would be relevant to that. And certainly your sensibility about that is correct. So it's just a question of what numbers, apply to that. Certainly, when you're talking about assistance, you can then look at, things like profitability and sales, and certainly in the room side of things. When in the meals and room tax in general, and there's a chart on total meals and rooms tax revenues on page 23, and this is like seasonally adjusted monthly data. You don't normally see the tax revenues reported this way, but this is the way we analyze them. Is just like government statistics. We have programs that calculate seasonality and then adjust for it, and then we express it in annual rates. But you'll see, this cliff that occurs, with the pandemic, and then just how, so it's about a 40% drop. We're looking at levels of revenue that we got 15 years ago for all meals and rooms. And it's also been pretty much dead in the water since that drop. It hasn't, there's no, we're not talking about a V-shaped recovery or U-shaped recovery. This is an L. It's gone down and it's just stayed down. And so it's distressing. And if you take out meals, that's the best part of it, because meals has dealt better with it than the rooms, obviously. And then if you look at the part of the rooms that's not the short-term online market, that's the part that's really been hurting. And alcohol is also way down. So the bars are down, but the rooms part of it that's not, short-term. Again, we say short-term online rental, but one of the other characteristics during the pandemic is there've been longer-term rentals. So people have wanted to use Airbnb type places as, remote working locations, and sort of like instantly having a second home. So, that's another feature of what's happening. Yeah.
So,
Senator Bray.
okay, and then
Okay. Well, it's all right. I had Senator Hardy.
Mhm.
I didn't see Senator Westman, so I thought you were seating. So
Yeah.
I've got
No,
Senator Hardy, then Senator Kitchell, then Senator Bray.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Senator Cummings. I first want to just make a comment about something you said, Tom, about how the federal government had a plan for the healthcare response to the pandemic, and that was so much better than their economic plan to the response to the pandemic. And if that is the case, that is even more pathetic, because their healthcare response to the pandemic was horrific.
The execution of the plan was horrific, but there was a plan. There's working groups in the federal government that were disbanded before the pandemic, whose job it was to do pandemic planning. And, all over the world, there are pandemic plans. So it was very poorly executed and, all that, but at least there was a plan. There was nothing equivalent in the economic world. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, there may have been a plan for the healthcare response, but they threw it out the window immediately or ignored it. So that just isn't indicative of how bad just across the board everything was. And the other comment I wanted to make, and then I do have a question, is that, in terms of our ability, the state's ability as the state legislature to target the federal money that we got, of the $6.5 billion or was it 5 billion total? We only had 25% of it in our sort of coffers to direct. And so much of that had to go to the immediate pandemic response that we had less at our disposal to sort of target to economic recovery. And hopefully moving forward, we can focus more on economic recovery as we move out of the pandemic. Although it seems like this recent round that was allocated at the end of December by the feds is less flexible. We may have fewer options in terms of how we're allowed to spend it. So I guess it just sort of depends on the sort of Biden plan moving forward as to how much flexibility we'll have. But those were my comments. But my question goes back to something I think you said in response to Senator Starr regarding the education fund. And you made a comment about the teacher pension situation and how the estimates took into consideration the teacher pension payments. And I'm wondering if that is true for the sort of long-term pension payments or just this year, and how your report interacts potentially with the recent proposal the treasurer made regarding the pension program. And maybe that's a question for her, but it seems to me that we didn't get enough good news that we're just taking care of that problem. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it might have been Steve that had
Yeah.
mentioned something about pensions.
Okay, so-
But I can talk about that separately, but go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so I would just say, yeah, so the normal cost is already covered in the ed fund for this year, and normal cost should not go up that stunningly in the next few years. So that's, but you raised the right point. One thing that the pension problem is in part due to the whole pandemic, where the returns last year were terrible, and they're in the 4% range when the assumption was 7%. There's nothing to help with that, and so in the sense, one of the things that we are looking for in the new relief would be revenue, the ability to use some of the money for the state expenses, and maybe that could be helpful there. But the pension plan remains a very major issue for us to face in the years ahead. And while it may not be as much of an issue for the ed fund in the short term, for the general fund, it's pretty overwhelming. And the second area is it doesn't do anything for the OPEB requirements, which really are a big part of both. So you're correct on that.
Okay, great. I just want to clarify.
I don't know if Tom, you wanted to add anything on that at all.
Thanks,
Yeah, I mean, all I'd add is that the pension problem in the first place goes back to much more mortal sins than the recent issues that we have, venial sins. But the absence of a forecasting process that looked at ranges, did alternative simulations, and then did true ups on a timely, regular basis, so that if some assumption that you made was being missed, that you could have a course correction early on, identify the problem, and do a reset. That didn't happen, and it just kept these pie in the sky assumptions about what was going to occur, and then push the problem off into the future. And now it's yours to deal with, but that is a problem, a process problem that it hopefully doesn't get repeated. But again, you have to have scenarios that don't always assume that things are going to be like they were before, and that you make adjustments if there's something that's off with it early on, so it doesn't just accumulate as an issue.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I had Senator Kitchell, Senator Bray, and now Senator Brock.
Yeah, I think what we need to be clear is we are assuming the new ADEC of the 38 million, which was a fairly substantial increase as a result of a whole lot of factors, and that's an ongoing cost, and normal. So the general fund is still covering all that underfunding, and that is separate and apart from just paying the annual ADEC amount. But the question I have, Tom, and it goes back to the targeting of businesses, and this new bill that just got passed. Half of it is not coming through the state at all in the form of block grants or whatever, or to be appropriated or whatever. A lot of it's business relief. Have you had a chance to look at how you see what's in that bill relative to the experience that we've just had with putting money out? Some people, we heard anecdotes that some businesses are doing so well, they were prepaying their rent, and their, accountants were saying there was just a lot of money that went to places it didn't need to go. Do you see that the bill that has just been passed and what it's doing for businesses is going to replicate that? Because we've heard some businesses are being left out. Can you give us a sense of what you see is in that bill relative to our business community?
I haven't spent a lot of time with the bill. We've been full tilt doing, analyzing revenues and looking at all this granular tax data and, lead up to this. So that's been 15 hours a day for a while. But the broad, some of the big spending initiatives, basically repeat PPP, but have a fairly tame hurdle. At least there's a hurdle. There was really no meaningful hurdle before. So a little bit of a hurdle. But again, sending out $600 to everybody is not targeting, so those two big things, those two big parts of it are not well targeted. Maybe Steve or somebody from Joint Fiscal would like to comment on any other aspect of it if they've looked at it more closely. I think we'll be waiting more for the next, if there's a next tranche or whatever's in the next tranche. I think something is likely, but who knows what size it'll be. That maybe is both more flexible for states and if there is additional money more targeted. But again, they're talking about another $1,400 and just send it out to everybody, and that's not optimal. From an economic perspective, that's not optimal. Steve, do you have anything to say about the details of the other bill, or Graham, or?
Well, not too much. I think we're really a long way from seeing that bill become a reality. There's a lot of
no, the one that's passed, though. The one that passed. Yeah.
So I would just hold off till we know more.
Because Joyce Manchester did do a breakout, I think, of the $920 billion measure, Rescue and Relief Act. So anything else in that you see relevant to?
Well, I think that that we've discussed that bill before. There's going to be, that bill is very has a lot of complications. I mean, and one of which the committee is already dealing with is the vendor assistance, where it's a lot of money in a short time. I don't know that there's anything I'd have to add right now.
Okay.
Ray, and then Senator Brock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I wanted to double back to what Senator McDonald was talking about a little bit. I mean, the consciousness that we have about we're all in this together, but really actually not everyone is coming out of this together in the same way. And how can we minimize the disparities and maybe even equalize things a little bit through targeted help? So I'm wondering about investments that will be more than a cash injection for the near term, and how suitable they do or do not seem to you. And one of the things that we're working on in natural resources and energy is to improve our weatherization program, because there's plenty of data that shows investments there save people money, for the lifetime of that home. And that particularly for lower income Vermonters, they already suffer, a higher energy burden, where they may be spending up to 20% of their money just buying energy products of one sort or another. And so is that too slow, the kind of an investment to make to be considered as part of a recovery program and for these kinds of dollars? Does that seem like a stretch, or does that seem like, no, actually that's a decent idea? Because when you make that kind of investment, you hire people, you train them, they do the installation, and then the beneficiaries have benefits for years and decades to come. So I'm just wondering about that kind of thing, especially with a target on low income weatherization.
Yeah, well, I think any place you can spend on something that you think makes sense anyway to do, but can be brought under the umbrella of the requirements of any of these tranches of federal money that come out, can be really, really impactful. So there's some things like broadband that have been, people wanted to do, and then clearly can sort of be connected to it. The problem is usually timing, how much you can do in a short period of time, and that's very limiting. So I'm not conversant with the exact legal requirements of the latest bill, and maybe Steve or people at Ledge Council and other places can help craft things that would try to look at the exact language of the bill and what you can bring in under it and what you can't. I think it's a great idea to try to do the things that make sense anyway, that will have good returns. If you can use this kind of money for that, it frees up money that otherwise we're raising taxes to have to pay for, and that's that's a huge benefit to the state, because you get the benefit of the investment and then you save money that you might have spent anyway for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Brock.
Tom, I wonder if we could go back to the commentary that you had about warning signals that our pension fund was perhaps going off the rails. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about what were some of the warning signs along the way, and how reaction by the legislature could have changed the trajectory. And secondly, if you have any commentary about your view of the adequacy of the annual rates of return that we are even now projecting.
Yeah, I think that's really what it goes down to, is what do you assume the rate of return is going to be? And, just looking at past information isn't the way to do that. So you have to run alternative scenarios. First of all, you have to have one that says, if everything goes like we think probably it will, here's kind of the path we expect, and so this is reasonable. And then you probably want to be a little bit conservative on that and say, all right, the one we're going to actually use is a little bit below even the one we think is most likely. Because if we have an error, it's better to have a little bit more than to be under. But when it starts to become clear to you that, okay, we missed that year, or we're in a pandemic and guess what, interest rates are now zero and we're in a different world, then, if you've run scenarios that had, different ranges, you would, you would recognize, okay, something's different, and you act quickly. The magnitude of the problem now goes back to earlier misses where the assumptions were just either they're willfully Pollyanna-ish, and I was involved in them, and I participate in capital debt affordability advisory committee now, but I was not involved in any of the earlier pension fund analysis or work. But that's essentially what the purpose of forecasting is, and why you would run alternative scenarios, and then frequently check in and say, are we right? Is it on the same path? And what could go wrong? And maybe there's a range. So yeah, that's all.
To follow up on that, Tom, and Senator Brock's question, we raised that question about, we have a 5-year period, and I raised the question, isn't that too long a period of time to not make, to recalibrate and check out assumptions. I realize a year may be too little, you know, because of things needing to smooth out. But, you know, we were talking about 3 or something, but 5 years, if you're underfunding and your assumptions aren't panning out, you are accruing a lot of obligation, liability until you come in and true up. And frankly, right now, all that unfunded liability that with that truing up is falling to the general fund.
Yeah.
And so the education fund, which now the ADEC has been readjusted to 38, and I never could understand why it went down from 6 to into the 7 million to the 6 million, and when it back in 13, it was 11 million. And so it just, I guess I'm asking you, or to expand a bit on your comment to Senator Brock about should we, with greater frequency, be sort of recalibrating, or and it's 5 years really. By the time it trues up, we've built up a tremendous amount of liability.
Yeah, no, I think you should do a check-in on that at least not once a year, twice a year. And, you know, the pandemic shows how quickly an environment can change. You know, you're going along one way, all of a sudden something happens, and there's a radical change in interest rates and interest rate expectations. And so, you know, you have to do check-ins more frequently. Doesn't mean everything has to get revoted and redone, but there's a check-in and an opportunity if there's something significant that there can be an adjustment made, and that should be much more frequent.
Michael, and you're muted.
I can hear, I didn't know I was recognized. Sorry, maybe I'm coming into this conversation late, but is it mostly the interest rate assumptions that's driving the debt? Because I remember, it seems, I can still see the picture of Jeb Spalding and the NEA, and I think the VSEA and the Cedar Creek room announcing this great compromise where everybody was giving something to fix the pension funds, maybe 10 or 12, maybe longer ago, years. And since that time, when it was supposedly there being a significant course correction, what has been the single largest factor that's made, seems like, the problem worse than it was even before the fix of a dozen years ago?
I wasn't party to that fix, nor have I been involved in the process since then. It's only been a year that, due to legislative action, that I was asked to be a non-voting member of CDAC. So I can't really address that.
Yeah, I would just say it's really, the latest change is a mixture. About half is the interest rate and half is demographic adjustments. People are living longer. Healthcare costs have changed. There are a lot of factors that have gone into the demographics, and that might be worthwhile to bring in Beth Pierce or the actuaries to talk about those two components.
Any other questions at this point?
There was one other thing, Ann, that was asked that I didn't respond to, was potentially some of the longer term impacts on the education fund from property tax appreciation. We don't do the, the education forecast is done in 2 different places and times. So the property tax part of it's done in the fall, prior to the tax rate letter being issued. And then the parts of it that came from the former general fund and transportation fund are done regularly as part of this forecast. So the property tax part of it, moves much more slowly because it's an entire grand list. It's huge. So you don't get, gigantic swings quickly. and there are delays in the way that gets processed. But we're going into a period where there's going to be a lot more price appreciation and price growth in real estate in general. That would have happened without the pandemic, and the pandemic's going to accelerate that somewhat. It's not going to be something immediate, but we're going to be seeing more grand list growth, both through appreciation, a little bit of new construction, but we're in an unusual situation where we're going to be getting quite a bit of residential construction relative to prior expectations, but less non-residential. And that's unusual. Usually those two things move together, and they're going to be going in opposite directions. So there will be some grand list impacts, but they're quite a ways down the road. And so far that's not, that's not part of the planning that's been done. There's a little bit of adjustment done back in October, but that's something else that we'll be looking into more.
Okay. Further questions, discussion? Anything, information you'd like as follow-up? Senator McDonald.
When would we likely have firm enough numbers to make decisions on spending vis-a-vis additional government payments?
I think that's more a function of when additional monies are coming in. And Steve, maybe you can speak to the flows from already approved but not dispersed funds in terms of timing. I mean, the $600 checks have already gone out, but I don't know about anything more discretionary, what the timing is on all that.
Well, no, it's all over the map. Some of the money comes this month, and we're going to already be doing it. Some we'd hold it's 90 days away. And a lot of the money is coming, like the broadband is going to be kept at the administration is going to run that through companies. It's really quite a one of the really differences in this new bill from the CRF bill, the last one, was there we got a big tranche of money, 1.25 billion within 30 days of the passage of the act. Here, every section is its own world, and the administration of each section is different. And we will be getting the education money, a good chunk of that right up front. Where the language says we send some of that out to schools, but there's no time in that. So we're going to require a lot of staff and a lot of legislators looking in their own areas and their own sort of focus and trying to identify what's going on in that particular line of funding. It's just not as clean, and every section has its own. Some of the money comes through existing lines, like transportation. There's not a whole new appropriation. Rental assistance is through a separate appropriation. A lot of the HS money is through existing lines. So it's a collection of a lot of different components.
Because of all the things that Steve just said, my question was, when will we know the answers to all those things so we can make decisions? So
we're starting to make decisions now in transportation, for example, in the budget adjustment, I think is 1.6 million out of that block grant of 50.4 million, which we were told this morning a notice had been received. That goes through the same CFDA account and therefore flows directly to the department, to the agency to be appropriated. So I think the challenge is there's so many multiple avenues that the portion that comes through the state is going to take. But in transportation, some of that money, in fact, the award came in, I think, today. And I think that for the housing, the 200 million, there's a date for that to be available to the state as well. Steve, do you remember the date on that?
It'll be the 26 is the first 55% will come in.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Steve, is there money in the new bill, the federal bill, for broadband? I thought I'd heard there really wasn't.
Yeah, the $50, there is a $50 a month payment for broadband, but that's going to be administered and I heard this morning, that's going to come in through the companies. Through, they're going to offer that they're working through companies to come and offer it to their clients, which I really haven't seen that myself. So that's something that there's also in that bill some language that says $300 million for rural broadband. Well, and I don't know anything about that. I don't know where that goes, but it's something we need to figure out. And everything is administered by different agencies of the federal government and coming in on different time scales. And I would say we need that's an example. We need to find that out. And
Okay, we've got people, I think, I'm trying to schedule next week to come in and talk to us about those lifeline programs that the companies put out, that the state, and deadlines and all the rest of it. Because we don't know how many people are hooked up at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got Senator Ballant and then Senator Sears.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So Steve, just looking at the documents that legislators can refer to on the website for Joint Fiscal Office, I know that there's a good breakdown that NCSL put together section by section on this most recent bill. And there's also another document that basically gives a division by division summary of the appropriations provisions. Is there any other document that senators and that we can look to get a breakdown, much to Ann's question, like what's in it for broadband? What's in it for these particular targeted areas that each of us are keeping a watchful eye on? Anything else there on joint fiscal we can look at?
We're nothing else on Joint Fiscal's website. We need to, like today, there was testimony on AHS. Sarah Clark testified in House and Senate Health and Welfare and Healthcare committees, and she gave us a PowerPoint which talked about some of the money coming into her. But even in that PowerPoint, there were big, $100 million is coming from administration. We don't know the Vermont share. So, unfortunately, this is when the bill passed on December 27th. We're in a real time. We'll keep putting things up there, but I think it's something we're trying to figure out on the staff level, and also legislators have to and the administration has to, about how do we sort of get that information in these categories in a useful way so you make decisions. A lot of it is going to be pass through. I think in the AHS and transportation, where the departments are getting the money, it's going to come right through an existing line, and then the committees are going to have to consider, what do they do with the flexibility that they have, and so that's the easier stuff. It's but it's not an easy situation. We will redouble our efforts to try to find out what's out there in the way of stuff.
And whenever you post something else, you guys are great about letting us know. I just will reiterate that so many senators are just hungry for information on how they can actualize this information in their committees of jurisdiction. So
maybe we should adopt the practice which we did on the off session, or just every time we post something new, just send a notice to all legislators that this just went up. Okay, good point.
Okay. Senator Sears, right? I had you.
Yeah, I think mine's actually a follow-up to Senator Ballant and Senator Sorokin, and Tom's comment about keeping track of what's going on. I'm frankly overwhelmed trying to deal with this through a Zoom method. We all have our areas where we concentrate to some extent, but we have a lot of misinformation too. And trying to pin down that misinformation that many of our constituents get. It's all very difficult. So the more we can get information, even if we all don't get to read it. And Tom's idea of re-looking at things in an interim period is a good one. I'm afraid we're in a situation where we're going by a calendar of when the legislature meets. This may not be the best time for the legislature to be meeting. It may be better, 2 or 3 months from now when we have better information. Particularly what you said about the schools, Steve, that somebody said, schools are going to get this, the schools are going to get that. We don't know when they're getting it. Will they get it directly from the feds? Will they, it be passed through DOE? How's this all going to work? And then we're making decisions, and they're making decisions at town meeting on March 2nd. completely without information about what the federal help's going to be. I think it
You
gets,
know, I would just respond that there's really almost no good time because the rent subsidy money, if you don't spend it by September 30th, it goes to other states. And so when we have a couple other provisions like that where they have just said to us, you need to get it out there or you lose it. And there's some of that in the education language too. So, but I think you're totally right. And this is something Senator McDonald made the point the other day. The numbers are changing all the time. You know, the rules are going to change all the time, like they did last time. And we may get more money in a new bill. So I think it's just the nature of the pandemic that we're living in you know, the money's coming in a strange way. The needs are changing. It's going to be that feeling of just constantly trying to keep up. And yeah, I just don't know that you can really wait, or we have a potential to lose a lot of dollars because of the way they did the bill.
that's helpful, Steve, to know that can't wait, but maybe we.
It's awful. It's really bad. Yeah.
Well, and doing it by Zoom makes it all the more difficult.
Yeah.
And we may have to do like we did before, and that is try to set up an alternative structure so we can make, which we use joint fiscal committee. We worked almost continuously because of the need to make decisions quickly, but couldn't make them at, you know, within the official session.
A senator I know from Maryland sent a picture of his chamber from up above, and they've all got plexiglass. They sit in plexiglass chairs surrounded by plexiglass so they can meet in person in the chamber.
I think I'd take this.
Yeah, so I'm not sure there's any good solution to this problem of Zoom.
I can't see a committee room with plexiglass cages without.
He didn't send a picture of the committee rooms, but the
Yeah.
chamber is very elegant, you know, but the plexiglass is around every chair. Completely. I don't know how they get in. Maybe from above they jump in.
Senator Ballard.
Yeah, just, you know, to speak to what Senator Sears was saying, I know a number of senators have talked to me about, do we need to structure it similarly to last session, in that we work hard until some point in May, we take a break, and then we have to reconvene. I don't think we have clarity on that yet, but certainly I welcome the input from everyone on this call. I want your best thinking about how this can work. I'm really looking to the wisdom of all of you. Certainly I'm engaged with the speaker on this same question, which is, what is the right schedule for us to keep in order to spend this money the best way for Vermonters? So
I think the big unknown is what will be subsequent legislation from Washington. That, you know, that
absolutely,
because it seems like there's going to be, if at least the way they're describing it, money coming to cities and states to help with the COVID. So but this is, we shouldn't keep Tom with our lamentations about what we might be having to do over the summer. I don't know. Just an announcement for appropriations. After we finish this joint session, we have to, we have one item of business this afternoon. So just want to alert people. And so I'm not sure whether we have more questions of Tom, or logistically, whether finance is going to be meeting again after we finish this
That's what
session.
I'm checking. Now, we have committee discussion on state finances, but I think, given the schedule we've been keeping, and it's now 3:18, that we just won't meet today unless the committee really feels like they need to talk. It takes a while, even having been up to our eyeballs in joint fiscal in all of this for months, it still takes a while to process everything we've heard today. And think about Senator Starr. Bobby. Yeah, Bobby,
You're
you're
muted.
That, I was trying to make you all happy. You wouldn't have to listen to me. But anyways, I'm wondering, we have people that, like Tom, that come along and suggest things to us and revenue coming and does a good job at that. Do we have anyone that double checks? Because we have Klein that also comes along, and then we have Tom backing in back of him. Do we have anybody in state government that checks on our finances as in regards to, are we getting the best deal possible on our investments, so we're recouping the best interest rates and things like that? Because, you know, this downgrading from 7.5 to 7, and how our interest rates haven't done well to keep up with the teachers' retirement. You know, I don't know a lot about finances, but a little bit. And the last few years have been not that bad in making money on investments. And I mean, we hear stories constantly about, you know, our poor, or we aren't doing that well with our investments. And I'm wondering if we have anybody looking after the people that are doing this to make sure it's being done properly and in our best interest.
I know something, but I have a feeling Steve knows it.
Well, I would just say the treasurer's office is really charged with a lot of this. And they, you know, I would say basically they do a pretty good job, but I think you need to bring them in to talk about this question.
We
And
did get some testimony yesterday from the new person at Joint Fiscal talking about, and maybe you can talk to this point, Tom, that because of the sort of mix of investments that you have to have for retirement, for pension funds, it's hard to equate the return you would get simply with equities with what you would have with this portfolio of investments. But that's been a topic of discussion, certainly in committee, about what is a reasonable return assumption, and then how does the performance of our funds stack against that, and how are our funds performing compared to other pension funds around the country?
Yeah, no, that's worth looking at, and you know, you've always got risk and reward that are related. So, you know, generally speaking, you have pretty low tolerance for risk with something like a pension fund. So you're not going to expect the highest returns, but worth comparing, worth looking into, and making sure that you're competitive. I think most of that is outsourced by the treasurer, but best to have her and her staff come in and talk about that.
Senator Bray, I saw you.
More expert people than I have already spoken on this, so I'll pass. Just that, you know, in talking with the treasurer about returns, my study impression is that she's very risk averse, and you know, so I think sometimes our returns are more modest than the impression we get from reading general financial news.
You know, whatever the returns are, it's just good to have, you know, simulations that allow and tracking that allows you to make adjustments if you're wrong, even if you're starting low, so you're not as far off. It's just good to make adjustments quickly. And maybe now they've got that going. I don't really know, but certainly in the past, that wasn't the case.
That isn't anything, Tom, that you look at, right?
No, I don't look at that as, now that I'm participating in CDAC, I can ask more questions and get information, but I'm not voting on it and I'm not advising on it. I'm just sort of some additional eyes and ears for the legislature on what's happening there, as is Steve Klein and Catherine Benham also sit in on those meetings.
Well,
Final questions? Senator Sirotkin. You're unmuted.
Does the legislature have any votes on CDAC?
None. And that, that may be something you want to look at having, because right now, it's one thing to be on a committee, but if you're not voting, it's not like you can, you just ask questions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like a huge amount of policy is dictated by their recommendations. And it seems that the
million.
legislature should have more power there.
Well, we've certainly seen the recommendations in terms of bonding be reduced significantly as a result of the recommendations, which we've not altered from. So, okay. Well, if we're finished, I'm going to ask appropriations to stay on.
Okay, and we'll have finance. And Faith, I see you're back on. You and I can talk, I guess, tomorrow at noon is if we're set, or you can give me a call.
Thank you.